Imagine walking into the headquarters of a Chinese tech giant, one of those glass and steel monoliths, where the air is thick with the expectation of the next OpenAI killer. You find the lead researcher, a man like Justin Lin, who heads Alibaba's Quinn team, and you ask him the question everyone is thinking: when do we overtake them? You're likely expecting a bold manifesto or a secret timeline for global dominance. Instead, he looks at a spreadsheet, sighs, and gives you a number that feels like a cold shower: less than 20%. He isn't pessimistic about his team's brilliance or their work ethic. In fact, he's remarkably calm, almost detached as he explains the math. While the world imagines a high-stakes battle of geniuses, inside these labs it's a desperate game of resource triage. He describes a reality where for every hour they spend trying to invent the future, they spend 10 hours just trying to keep their current chatbot from collapsing under the weight of its own users. It is a bizarre, quiet paradox. In the West, we see the headlines about fundamental breakthroughs, but on the ground in Hangzhou or Beijing, the conversation is about the inference tax. The more popular their AI becomes, the further they fall behind in the race to improve it. It's like watching a marathon runner who has to stop every 100 yards to sell water to the spectators just to afford his next pair of shoes. This isn't a story about a lack of vision or running out of ideas. It's a story about the brutal, invisible constraint of compute allocation. When 90% of your power is spent just keeping the lights on for existing users, research doesn't just slow down, it gets squeezed into the margins. That instantaneous shift from "we will win" to "we just need to survive the bill" is redefining the global AI race. It turns out the gap between leaders and followers isn't just about intelligence, it's about who can afford to burn the most silicon on a dream. So that number, less than 20%, is just startling.
Yeah.
I think, most of us looking from the outside, we assume that if you got the engineers, you've got the data, you push a button and the AI gets smarter.
Right. But that story, it suggests that something fundamental in the mechanism is, well, broken. It sounds less like a software problem and, honestly, more like a logistics nightmare.
It is exactly that. It's a logistics and an economics nightmare. And frankly, if you're only reading the headlines about, new model releases or benchmark scores, you are missing the entire bottom half of the iceberg.
The messy part.
The really messy part. And that 20% figure, that's not an exaggeration, it's an accounting reality. So when we talk about resource triage, we are describing an entire ecosystem that is, in a way, suffocating under its own success.
How so?
Well, every new user that interacts with the Chinese AI model is, in effect, stealing compute cycles away from the researchers who are trying to build the next version.
So, okay, the mission for this deep dive then, it isn't really to get into the weeds of the code or compare model parameters.
No, not at all. The mission is to uncover the physical and the economic engineering that's being deployed to solve that 20% problem.
And to do that, we're looking at a whole stack of reports today. We are. We have intelligence from Strider Technologies, some policy papers from the SCSP, academic work, energy analysis, and together they paint a very, very different picture of the AI race.
A picture that's less about the software?
Exactly. It's not about who writes better Python code. It's about how China is trying to bypass this so-called inference tax and, the U.S. chips sanctions, not with better code, but with massive scale infrastructure.
And by infrastructure, we're talking about?
We are talking about energy grids, state-led capital, and the literal reshaping of the country's geography to serve the needs of AI.
Okay, you mentioned bypassing sanctions through infrastructure. That seems counterintuitive to me. I mean, if you can't get the chips, you can't get the chips right. How does building a power plant solve a silicon shortage?
That is the central question, and it's a brilliant question. If you are constrained on one variable, in this case, the efficiency of your high-performance computing because of sanctions, you have to overcompensate somewhere else.
On another variable.
On another variable. And China has decided that the variable they can control, the one they can crank up to 11, is energy.
So the thinking is, if they can't make the chips more efficient, they'll just make the energy so abundant and so cheap that efficiency stops mattering as much. It's a brute force solution.
Okay, before we get deep into the economics of that, I really want to ground this physically. We talk about compute like it's this abstract cloud, but it has to live somewhere.
It does. And where it lives, as it turns out, matters immensely. I was reading through some industry reports recently, and I came across a story about an engineer named Chen stationed in a remote data center in the Gansu province. Imagine a landscape where the wind never stops blowing, and the horizon is dominated by rows of white turbines. Chen's job isn't just about maintaining servers, it's about timing. He watches the energy pulse the moment the wind picks up and the local power grid surges with surplus green energy. In those windows, the data center roars to life, channeling massive computing power back to the research labs in Shanghai. I heard that Chen describes it like catching lightning in a bottle. For him, the struggle isn't about writing a better algorithm, it's about the sheer physical reality that AI consumes a terrifying amount of electricity. If the nation can't bridge the gap between the windy West and the hungry East, the smartest code in the world will simply run out of breath. Looking at Chen's perspective, it's clear that we've moved past the era where AI was just a software game. As a creator who follows these trends, I see this east-to-west computing strategy as a desperate, massive-scale physical response to a digital bottleneck. It's easy to talk about innovation, but it takes a different kind of national resolve to build the literal pipes and wires that keep a research model from being cannibalized by the cost of its own existence.
That image of Chen, waiting for the wind to blow in Gansu, it's the perfect encapsulation of this whole strategy. It's a formal national policy called the East Data West Compute Initiative.
And it's the primary mechanism they're using to solve this energy problem.
It is. It's their grand design.
Okay, East Data West Compute. It sounds straightforward enough, but let's pick that apart. Why the separation? Why not just build all the data centers in Shanghai, right, where the developers and the users are?
Because Shanghai is full, for one thing.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly expensive. But more than that, you have to think about the geography of China. The Eastern Seaboard, Beijing, Shanghai, the Greater Bay Area, that's where the people are. That's the population density.
That's where the users are.
That's where the users are. So when you ask a chatbot a question, that's what we call an inference task. And it needs to happen instantly. You can't tolerate the latency of sending that question halfway across the continent and then waiting for the answer to come back.
Okay, right. The speed matters for the user experience.
It's critical. So the East handles the data interaction, the real-time stuff, the user-facing applications.
So that part stays on the coast. But then West Compute is for what exactly?
That's for training. Training a model, teaching it to be smart in the first place is a very different kind of task. It's what we call a batch process. It can take weeks, sometimes months.
So it doesn't need to be instant.
Not at all. It just needs to be massive. And the Western provinces, places like Gansu, Inner Mongolia, Guizhou, they are perfect for this.
Why there?
Well, they're sparsely populated, so land is cheap. The climate is naturally cooler, which is a huge deal because it saves a fortune on air conditioning for the servers. But the most important thing,
the energy.
They're swimming in renewable energy. Wind, solar, hydro, it's all out there.
Which brings us back to the energy numbers. I saw a statistic in our notes about the capacity difference between the US and China, and I honestly thought it was a typo.
I am not surprised. It's a staggering number. But it wasn't a typo. Let's just look at the gap for a second. So right now, the United States is, it's panicking about a projected 47 gigawatt gap in data center power needs. We're worried our grid just can't handle the AI boom.
And 47 gigawatts is a huge amount of power. I mean, that's enough to power tens of millions of homes. It's a real crisis for U.S. tech firms.
It is. I read that same report. Utility companies in places like Virginia are literally turning away new data centers because they just can't hook them up to the grid.
Right. So that's the U.S. picture, 47 gigawatts. What's the comparison?
So compare that 47 gigawatt gap to what China is building. In the year 2025 alone, a single year, China is projected to add 430 gigawatts of new power generation capacity.
I'm sorry, can you say that number again?
430 gigawatts.
In 1 year?
In 1 year, yes. To put that in perspective for you, 430 gigawatts is roughly double the entire installed electricity generation capacity of Germany.
So they're adding 2 Germany's worth of power in a single year.
That's right. So the 47 gigawatt gap that is basically paralyzing U.S. infrastructure planning is, it's a rounding error in China's rollout.
That's staggering. But okay, having all that power out in Gansu is one thing, but moving it thousands of miles to where it's useful, that's another. I mean, physics is physics, right? You lose a ton of power in transmission. Doesn't that defeat the purpose?
Normally it would, yes.
Yeah.
In a standard grid, what's called line loss makes that kind of long distance transmission incredibly inefficient. Yeah. But this is where the UHV lines come in. Ultra-high voltage transmission. This is a technology China has spent the last decade perfecting. They have something like 42 active UHV corridors. Think of them as electricity superhighways.
And they operate at a much higher voltage.
Much higher. We're talking 800,000, even 1 million volts. And because of the physics of it, higher voltage means drastically less power is lost along the way.
So they can shoot that power across the country.
It allows them to achieve what's called unified dispatch. They could take that sudden surge of wind power that Chen sees in Gansu and just shoot it to a factory in the east or a training cluster in the west with minimal waste.
Whereas the U.S. grid is, what, more fragmented?
Much more. We basically have 3 main grids, and they barely talk to each other. China is building a single, countrywide circuit board.
Okay, I want to connect this all back to the chips, though. We established that sanctions prevent them from buying the top-tier NVIDIA GPUs, the H100s. So even if you have all the power in the world, a slower chip is still a slower chip. Doesn't that still mean slower AI?
It does, but this is where the economics gets really clever. This is where the inefficiency subsidy comes into play. It's a brute force economic solution to a technology problem.
Explain that term for me, inefficiency subsidy.
Okay, so let's say you're a Chinese AI company and you're forced to use a domestic chip, like the Huawei SN910B. It's a decent chip, it's pretty good, but it is not an H100. It's probably slower, and critically, it's likely much less energy efficient.
Meaning it uses more electricity to do the same amount of work.
Exactly. It creates more heat, does fewer calculations per watt. So in a free market with high energy prices, using that chip would be financial suicide. You'd go broke paying the electric bill before you even finish training your model.
Right, because efficiency is the whole ballgame in data centers. It's all about performance per watt.
But what if the state steps in? Specifically, what if the provincial governments in places like Guizhou or Gansu step in and say, hey, build your data center here and we will slash your electricity costs by 50%?
Then the math totally changes.
The math flips on its head. Suddenly, you can afford to be inefficient. You can afford to run larger clusters of these weaker chips. You can just burn silicon and burn electricity to get the same result that a Western company gets with fewer, better chips.
So the cheap energy is literally acting as a counter-sanction. It's neutralizing the financial penalty of using less advanced hardware.
Precisely. It allows them to stay in the race not by matching the US in semiconductor lithography, but by overwhelming the problem with sheer kilowatts.
That addresses the massive infrastructure side, but I want to zoom back in now to the companies themselves. The people sitting in those glass towers we talked about at the start. They're the ones living with the daily reality of this inference tax.
Yes. For them, it's not a theoretical policy problem. It's about survival.
I saw a thread online from a young CTO in Beijing who had to make a heartbreaking choice. Her startup had a popular AI-driven app, but as the user base grew, the inference costs, the price of just keeping the app running, began to eat their entire budget. They had no compute left to actually train their next-generation model. I read that she called a midnight meeting and told her team they were no longer an AI application company. They were now a hardware-software optimization company. They spent 6 months not adding features, but stripping their code to the bone, making it run 40% more efficiently on aging GPUs they managed to source. She said it felt like trying to win a Formula One race while rebuilding the engine mid-lap to run on half the fuel. Watching this story unfold, I feel a sense of intense pressure. It's a survival pivot. We often hear critiques that certain ecosystems are just wrapping existing models, but what I'm seeing now is a forced evolution. When you are starved of the latest silicon, you don't just give up. You innovate at the architectural level. This isn't just about being smart. It's about the grit required to preserve that precious 20% of compute for research when the market is screaming for immediate profit.
That pivot she described, going from an AI application company to an optimization shop, that is happening all over the Chinese tech ecosystem. It's the direct, on-the-ground result of that inference tax we discussed.
So let's clarify the numbers on that tax. In the opening, it mentioned 10 hours keeping the lights on for every 1 hour of innovation. Is that 90-10 split a standard ratio?
It varies from company to company, of course, but the reports we're looking at indicate that for many of these firms, yes, 90% of their total compute resources are dedicated solely to inference.
Wow.
Which leaves just 10% for research and development, for training new models.
That seems completely unsustainable. I mean, if you're not training, you're not improving, you're just treading water, stagnating.
That is the existential danger they face.
And
you have to remember, the cost of training isn't static. It's getting more expensive exponentially.
By how much?
The data we have shows that training costs for these frontier models have been growing by about 2.4 times per year since 2016. So you have a situation where the price of just getting in the game is skyrocketing, but your R&D budget is being eaten alive by your current users.
And it's not just the cost of servers and electricity, right? The talent is also incredibly expensive.
Unbelievably so. For models like GPT-4 or Gemini Ultra, the cost of the R&D staff, The actual humans writing the code and running the experiments can account for anywhere from 29 to 49% of the total development costs.
So they're squeezed on hardware, they're squeezed on energy, and they're squeezed on talent costs. It's this massive capital barrier.
A huge one. Which brings us back to that CTO's decision. It makes perfect sense. If you can't buy more compute power, your only option is to make the compute you already have work harder.
So that's what this hardware-software co-optimization is all about.
Exactly. You know, in the West, because we've had relatively easy access to the best chips, there's a tendency to be a bit, well, lazy with the code. If a model is slow, the easy answer is just to throw more H100s at the problem.
Right. Brute force it with hardware.
But in China, that scarcity is forcing a different kind of innovation. Companies like Tencent are literally rewriting their software stacks from the ground up, squeezing every last drop of performance, trying to get, 2x the efficiency out of older chips or domestic alternatives.
It's the classic necessity is the mother of invention. But there has to be a limit to that, doesn't there? You can't just optimize your way to artificial general intelligence on a pocket calculator.
There is a limit. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that is why the state has to intervene again on another level. This optimizing strategy can keep the big players like Tencent afloat, but what about the little guys?
The startups.
The ones that could be the next DeepSeek or the next Alibaba. They can't afford the inference tax at all. They get crushed before they even start.
So how do they survive? I saw a mention in the notes of compute vouchers. Is that a literal thing? Like a coupon for a supercomputer?
It is surprisingly literal, yes. Cities like Shanghai, Hangzhou, Chengdu, they are issuing vouchers that can be worth millions of RMB to small and medium-sized enterprises.
And they can trade these in for server time.
They trade them for compute time in those big state-backed data centers. It's essentially a massive subsidy for their cloud rent.
So it lowers that huge capital barrier to entry.
It keeps the ecosystem diverse. The government seems to understand that if only the giants survive, innovation will eventually stifle. So they are, in effect, artificially propping up the ants to make sure the whole ecosystem stays vibrant and competitive.
This level of intervention, energy subsidies, compute vouchers, optimization mandates, it really throws a spotlight on the fundamental difference in the financial structure. Here in the US, we're all about venture capital. If you have a good idea, Andreessen Horowitz writes you a check. If you fail, well, you fail. But this seems different. There is a story circulating about Professor Zhang, a veteran researcher who moved from a high-flying venture-backed lab to a state-led research institute. In his old life, every week was a race to show growth to investors who didn't understand why a breakthrough takes years, not months. I heard him describe the venture capital model as a beautiful but fragile glass house, great until the first stone of a GPU shortage or a market dip hits it. Now, at the Institute, the pace is different. The compute allocation is guaranteed by a state-led capital structure. It's not flashy and it's heavily regulated, but it doesn't disappear when the stock market wobbles. He told a colleague that for the first time in a decade, he's not checking the company's burn rate before he hits run on a training cluster. Reflecting on Professor Zhang's journey, I see the fundamental tension of our era. On one hand, the state-led model provides a ballast, a stability that can weather the storm of global shortages. On the other hand, we must be careful that this stability doesn't turn into stagnation. As an observer, I recognize that while the venture-backed model is currently struggling under the weight of high costs, the state-led path carries the heavy responsibility of ensuring that sustainable doesn't mean slow. It's a delicate balance between the freedom to fail and the resources to succeed.
Professor Zhang's journey from the private to the public sector is emblematic of this massive shift in how innovation is funded. We're witnessing the rise of what you could call government venture capital.
Government venture capital?
Mm-hmm.
To a Western capitalist, that sounds like an oxymoron. Governments are notoriously bad at picking winners, right? They usually end up backing the wrong horse or just propping up zombie companies for years.
That is the traditional critique, yes, and it's often valid. But the data that's coming out of some of these academic papers on China's model, it really challenges that assumption, at least in this specific context.
How so?
Well, first, just the scale of this government VC is mind-blowing.
How big are we talking?
The research we looked at identified 1,863 of these government guidance funds. And over the last decade, they have invested approximately $900 billion into the tech sector.
I'm sorry, 900 billion? With a B.
$900 billion. It's nearly $1 trillion. It's not a venture fund. It's an entire parallel economy.
That's industrial policy. That's not venture capital.
It's industrial policy disguised as venture capital.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If you analyze the behavior of these state funds, versus private VCs, you see a completely different pattern emerge.
In what way?
Private money in China, much like it does in the US, it flocks to the hubs.
Yep.
Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen.
Yeah.
They chase high GDP, establish talent pools, and they want quick returns.
Naturally. You follow the money.
But the government VCs are geographically dispersed. They're deliberately investing heavily in lower GDP regions. They're putting capital into places private investors would never even look at.
But isn't that just a form of, I don't know, social spending or regional pork barrel politics? If private money is ignoring those companies, isn't it usually because they're not very good companies?
You would think so. That's the logical conclusion. But the data shows something really surprising. These government funds, they tend to invest in firms that have weaker ex-ante signals, meaning firms that don't have as many patents or products or established revenue when they first get the money. However, post-investment, these same firms often show higher growth rates than their private-backed counterparts.
Wait, that seems completely backward. How does that work? Is the government secretly a genius investor?
No, probably not. It's what the researchers call the signaling effect, or crowding in.
Okay.
In a market as volatile and heavily regulated as China's, private investors are incredibly risk-averse. They're terrified of sudden policy shifts that could wipe out their investment overnight.
Right.
But when a government VC invests in a small company, it sends a powerful signal to the rest of the market. The signal is, the state backs this company. This company is safe. It will not be allowed to fail.
So it completely de-risks the investment for everyone else. Private money sees that government flag planted in the ground and feels safe to follow.
Exactly. It creates this self-fulfilling prophecy of success. But the ultimate goal isn't just a 10x financial return. It's about what Professor Zhang called ballast. The state capital provides a floor. It allows these strategically important companies to survive market downturns, or chip shortages, or trade wars. A startup in Silicon Valley might die if its cash runs out for 6 months. A state-backed entity in China can just hibernate and wait for conditions to improve.
That ballast lets them play a much, much longer game. They're not worried about the next quarterly earnings call. They're worried about their strategic position in the year 2030.
Precisely.
And speaking of strategic positions, we have to talk about who is actually building all of this. We've talked about commercial tech giants, but there's another very big player in the room.
There is. And this is where we get into the concept of civil-military fusion. This isn't just about building better shopping apps or chatbots.
The Strider Technologies report had some pretty specific numbers on this, didn't it?
They did. They did a deep analysis of all the stakeholders involved in this massive data center build-out. The contractors, the software providers, the hardware makers, everyone.
And what did they find?
Out of 856 of these stakeholder entities that they identified, at least 88 had documented direct ties to the People's Liberation Army or the broader defense industrial base.
That's more than 10%. So the infrastructure for the commercial cloud is being built in part by the same people who build the national defense.
Often, yes. A perfect case study is the Chengdu Intelligent Computing Center. On the surface, it's a public utility. It processes data for smart city applications, optimizing traffic lights, managing waste disposal.
The public-facing stuff.
Right. But the center's own documents explicitly state its role in supporting PLA modernization and developing smart military solutions.
So it's a dual-use facility. The same server rack that's managing your morning commute could be an hour later running simulations for a drone swarm.
Correct. And it's not just on the hardware side. We see companies like Beijing Huarui Technology. They have developed a large model called XSimverse.
And that's not a language model for writing poetry.
Definitely not. It's a military simulation model specifically designed for things like unmanned swarm command and control and for complex wargaming scenarios.
That paints a very different and much more urgent picture of the inference tax. If 90% of your national compute is tied up in commercial inference, you're not just slowing down commercial research, you're potentially bottlenecking your national security applications too.
Which is exactly why this infrastructure push is so aggressive and so urgent. And it's why they are willing to try things that, to us, might seem like science fiction to solve the efficiency problem. We have to talk about the underwater data center.
I was hoping we'd get to this. The Hainan Subsea Intelligent Computing Center, I've seen the pictures. It looks like these giant futuristic pressure vessels being lowered into the ocean.
It's exactly what it looks like. They were deploying these server modules 30 meters underwater.
Is this just a PR stunt? Or is there real science behind doing that?
Oh, it's pure thermodynamics. It's brilliant, actually.
Yeah.
As we've said, heat is the #1 enemy of compute. A traditional data center spends a huge percentage of its entire energy budget just on air conditioning to keep the chips from melting.
Right, the cooling costs are massive.
By putting the center underwater, they are utilizing the ocean as a massive, infinite heat sink.
So they just pump the heat out into the sea.
Essentially. The ambient temperature of the seawater naturally cools the vessels. They claim this makes the entire facility 40% more energy efficient than a land-based equivalent.
40%?
It saves on fresh water, because they don't need cooling towers, and it saves massive amounts of electricity that would have been used for chillers.
So that 40% efficiency gain is the inefficiency subsidy in action again. They're using raw physics to claw back the performance they're losing on the sanctioned chips.
And here's the real kicker. The companies involved in that project, firms like Highlander and Sinnott, these are entities that are on U.S. sanction lists.
Wow.
They are literally innovating around the blockade by going underwater.
It's fascinating. You restrict the chip, so they completely change the environment the chip operates in. So where does this all lead? We've covered energy, capital, the military angle. What's the strategic end goal for 2025 and beyond?
The stated goal in the government reports is a concept they call embodied intelligence.
Embodies as in having a body, robots.
Yes. Exactly. AI that interacts with the physical world. For a long time, AI has been brains in a jar, just software running on a server somewhere. The next phase, as they see it, is putting that brain into a body.
So autonomous factors, humanoid robots, automated logistics, that kind of thing.
All of it.
So this whole East data, West compute grid, it was never just about training the next ChatGPT.
No, that's a stepping stone.
Yeah.
It's designed to be the central nervous system for what they call the industrial internet. If your national goal is to have a factory in Guangdong run entirely by AI-powered robots, you need massive, reliable, cheap compute to control them.
And you need both pieces.
You need low latency for the robot's real-time actions, which is the East data part, and you need massive continuous training for their brains, which is the West compute part. The whole system is designed for that.
That completely reframes the competition. You know, we in the West are often obsessed with who has the best chatbot, who passes the bar exam, but it sounds like they are looking at who has the most efficient automated industrial base.
Exactly. And it connects back to everything we've discussed today. The 430 gigawatts of new power, the UHV lines, the state-led capital. It's all about building a machine that's big enough to run a physical economy, not just a digital one.
It's been a heavy discussion, but I think we've successfully peeled back the layers here. We started with a single researcher looking at a spreadsheet, depressed about having only 20% of his resources for R&D.
And we ended up 30 meters underwater off the coast of Hainan.
The narrative arc is actually very clear now that we've laid it out. The U.S. strategy has been, to choke off the supply of the highest-end technology, the chips. We view the competition through the lens of semiconductors.
While China is viewing it through the lens of systems, they're effectively saying, okay, if we can't have the fastest engine, we will build the best road, we'll provide the cheapest fuel, and we'll create the most robust funding network to make sure the car never breaks down.
The inference tax is the bottleneck. It's the wall that they hit.
And their answer is to just flood the entire market with subsidized energy and compute vouchers to make that tax negligible. They're trying to make compute as cheap and abundant as tap water.
It really does challenge the simplified idea of who's winning or losing this race.
It does. I think we usually think of the winner of the AI race as the one who develops the smartest model, the most articulate chatbot. But looking at these massive underwater data centers and these cross-country power grids, it suggests a very different outcome is possible. The winner might not be the one who invents the most brilliant algorithm, but the one who builds the power plant big enough to keep it running forever.